On the morning of March 14th, 1853, a single revelation unraveled the social order of Southside Virginia. Catherine Denore, 23 years old, and the eldest daughter of one of the region's most powerful tobacco planters, was gone. She had vanished from her bedroom during the night. Vanishing alongside her was Samuel, a 26-year-old enslaved man, listed in her father's ledgers with a value of $1,200. But it was not the disappearance alone that sent panic through the county. It was what searchers uncovered beneath loose floorboards in Catherine's chamber. Hidden there were 47 letters, each written in Samuel's careful hand. They detailed not a kidnapping, but a deliberate, methodical escape planned over the course of 18 months. The consequences were unthinkable. Authorities seized and suppressed the letters at once, and for more than a century and a half, the truth remained locked away in courthouse archives, deemed too dangerous, too scandalous to confront until now. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Denore and the decision that would ruin 2 families and 4, an entire county to reckon with loyalty, betrayal, and the cost of forbidden attachment, pause for a moment. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories like this. And tell me, where are you listening from? Drop your city or state in the comments. Now, let's uncover what truly unfolded in the spring of 1853 when the unthinkable became reality. The letters reveal only one part of the story. The rest emerged through coerced testimonies, whispered confessions, and a grisly discovery made 6 months later in a cabin 30 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line. Denore Hall stood 3 miles beyond the town of Boynton, Virginia, a 2-story brick manor overlooking rolling tobacco fields that stretched toward the North Carolina border. The estate covered nearly 800 acres, worked by 53 enslaved individuals who lived in aging cabins arranged in precise rows beyond the main house. Colonel James Denore, widowed since 1847, ran the plantation with rigid discipline shaped by brief service in the Mexican War. Throughout Mecklenburg County, his reputation was flawless. A church elder, a Mason, a man known for honoring his debts and keeping his promises. Catherine had grown up within this ordered world. After her mother died of fever when Catherine was 17, she assumed control of the household, managing the kitchen, dairy, gardens, and domestic staff. Neighbors regarded her as competent and composed, if somewhat distant. By 21, she had rejected 3 marriage proposals, a decision that fueled quiet speculation among local families. Her father allowed her independence, perhaps because she managed the estate so effectively, or perhaps because his grief made him unwilling to send her away. Samuel arrived at Denore Hall in 1849, purchased at an estate sale in Richmond. His former owner, a schoolmaster, had taught him to read and write before dying suddenly, leaving debts that forced his widow to sell everything. Colonel Denore acquired Samuel specifically because of his literacy, intending to use him as a clerk to manage plantation records. A literate enslaved man was unusual, even controversial, but Denore valued efficiency over custom. For 2 years, Samuel worked in the small office attached to the main house, keeping ledgers, copying correspondence, and handling the daily paperwork of tobacco production. He was reserved, exacting, and careful never to overstep his place. He ate alone, lived in a narrow room beside the office rather than the quarters, and remained detached from the other enslaved workers. Some resented his position, others paid him no attention. He existed in a narrow, uneasy space, too educated for the fields, too enslaved for freedom. Virginia, in 1853, operated under rules that felt as fixed as nature itself. White and black, lives unfolded in separate worlds, governed by laws that dictated every interaction and punishment for violation. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made the North increasingly unsafe, granting federal commissioners broad authority to return escapees and penalize anyone who helped them. Border states had become contested ground, torn between abolitionist resistance and the economics of human bondage. Against this backdrop, Catherine and Samuel's interactions were uneventful for nearly 2 years. She brought household figures for transcription. He prepared letters for her father's signature. Their conversations were practical, brief, and always carefully observed. No one could say exactly when that changed, but sometime during the summer of 1851, Brief exchanges began to linger. Accounting questions evolved into discussions of books. Samuel had read Shakespeare, Milton, and the classical works that defined formal education. Catherine, educated by tutors yet isolated intellectually, found herself drawn into conversations that began with plantation matters and ventured far beyond them. By autumn, she was visiting the office more frequently, often in the evenings when her father was occupied elsewhere. She brought books from the library, volumes her father never touched. Samuel read aloud in a steady, restrained voice, stopping immediately whenever footsteps approached. Nothing was ever acknowledged openly. If questioned, Catherine said she was reviewing accounts. Samuel never spoke of it at all. Winter passed without incident. Then, in the spring of 1852, something shifted. Catherine arrived troubled, her questions sharper, more perilous. She asked about Samuel's life before Dunor Hall. She asked his thoughts on the heated debates in Congress over slavery's expansion. These were questions that could cost him his life if answered unwisely. In later testimony, Samuel's replies were described as measured and cautious. He never forgot, could never forget the reality of their positions, but he answered. And through those careful words, Catherine began to see not the property recorded in her father's accounts, but something her society insisted could not exist. By the summer of 1852, denial was no longer possible. The true nature of their relationship would later be argued, denied and twisted, yet one fact remains indisputable. By August, Catherine and Samuel were planning an escape, one that required betraying everyone she knew and risking both their lives for something that had no name in the language of 1853 Virginia. The planning was exacting. Samuel knew the amount of cash kept in the house safe. He understood the night patrol schedules. He knew which routes north were watched closely and which were neglected. Catherine supplied what he never could: the social calendar of the county's elites, the timing of her father's absences, the layout of the manor's interior. They communicated through letters concealed in a false bottom Samuel had carved into the accounting ledger during long winter evenings. Catherine slipped her notes inside when delivering household figures. Samuel replied. She retrieved his words the next day. Discovery meant certain death for him and social annihilation for her, but they continued. By winter, there were 47 letters. Each was more specific, more intimate, and more dangerous than the last. They discussed routes and dates, Quaker households rumored to shelter fugitives, the logistics of travel, and the meaning of what they were choosing. Written in carefully coded language, the letters revealed why they were willing to risk everything for something Virginia law insisted did not and could not exist. By early March of 1853, everything had been carefully arranged. Colonel Dunor was scheduled to leave for Richmond on the 13th to conduct tobacco business. Management of the house would fall to the elderly housekeeper, known for retiring early each evening. The night watchman followed a routine so consistent it bordered on ritual. Months earlier, Samuel had quietly duplicated the key to the household safe. Catherine had sewn suitable clothing for trial and packed it into a trunk she claimed contained winter garments destined for relatives in Tennessee. What neither of them realized, what they could not have anticipated, was that they were not the only ones making plans that spring, and the secret they guarded so closely was only one layer of a far deeper deception, one that extended beyond anything they imagined. The night of March 13, 1853, arrived without moonlight, cold and profoundly dark, the kind of night where sound is swallowed and familiar places feel unfamiliar. Colonel Dunor departed as planned that morning, riding to Richmond with his manservant on a journey expected to last 3 days. That evening, Dunor Hall settled into its routine with clockwork precision. Catherine withdrew to her room at 9 o'clock, as she always did. Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, checked on her briefly before returning to her own quarters in the rear wing. Silence followed. Below stairs, Samuel completed his customary duties. He banked the fire in the office and laid out the next day's correspondence on Colonel Dunor's desk. To anyone watching, nothing seemed unusual. What followed had to be reconstructed later through fragments of evidence and sworn testimony. No one witnessed their departure. Sometime between 10 o'clock and midnight, Samuel moved through the darkened house with the confidence of someone who had memorized every step. He unlocked the safe in Colonel Dunor's study, using the copied key, and removed roughly $300 in gold and paper currency, enough to fund trial. Not enough to draw immediate suspicion. Catherine never intended to sleep. Beneath her nightgown she wore travel clothes, and her packed trunk waited in the wardrobe. At the appointed hour, their watches long since synchronized, she left her room via the servants' staircase, bypassing the main stairs where a warp board on the third step would have announced her movement. They met in the summer kitchen, a detached structure connected to the manor by a covered passage. Behind it waited a small wagon Samuel had readied earlier under the pretense of transporting documents into town. Supplies lay hidden beneath canvas. Later investigators concluded that Catherine and Samuel left Dunor Hall on foot, pulling the wagon through the tobacco fields to avoid the main road and the slave quarters. The night watchman noticed nothing. The dogs did not bark. Both figures were too familiar to raise alarm. By dawn they were 15 miles north. In a wooded ravine, they abandoned the wagon and continued on foot through thick forest. Samuel guided them using landmarks he had memorized from office maps, specific creek crossings, unusual rock formations, the remains of an old mill. The alarm was raised at 7 the following morning. Mrs. Hawthorne knocked on Catherine's door to wake her and received no reply. Inside, she found the bed untouched. The wardrobe stood open, the trunk gone. At first, she assumed Catherine had fallen ill and gone to stay with neighbors, but the room disturbed her. She moved downstairs and checked Samuel's quarters. His belongings remained, but he was gone. In the office, the previous day's correspondence lay untouched, unthinkable given Samuel's habits. When she reported her concerns to the overseer, a coarse man named Taggart, his suspicion formed instantly. Samuel had run. A closer inspection of Catherine's room revealed no sign of a struggle. The absence of her traveling clothes confirmed the worst fear. Taggart rode at once to a neighboring plantation and dispatched riders in every direction, one to Richmond for Colonel Dunor, others to alert the magistrate, and assemble a search. By midday, 25 men had gathered at Dunor Hall. The truth began to surface. It was Taggart who uncovered the letters. Searching Samuel's room for clues, he found the false bottom of the account's ledger Samuel had neglected to destroy. Inside were the letters written in Samuel's unmistakable hand, addressed to Catherine with a closeness that stunned the men reading them. This was no abduction. It was a coordinated escape. Magistrate Howell, a gaunt man who had known Catherine since childhood, read only 3 letters before ordering them sealed. Though written in coded language, the meaning was clear and catastrophic. It threatened not only the Dunor name, but the social order the county depended upon. Howell locked the letters in his saddlebag and made a decision that would haunt him. The official account was made simple. Samuel had kidnapped Catherine and fled north, intending to hand her over to abolitionists eager to exploit her as propaganda. The letters, Howell declared, were fabrications designed to implicate Catherine and conceal Samuel's crime. Those who had read them knew better, but the truth was too dangerous to speak. Colonel Dunor returned late on March 15, riding through the night upon receiving the message. He arrived to find his land overtaken by a manhunt, horses tethered to every post, men camped in his fields. Taggart met him at the door and relayed the story carefully, emphasizing the kidnapping narrative. Colonel Dunor said nothing. His face was rigid as stone. He asked only one question: where are the letters? He read each one in silence. Then he looked at Magistrate Howell. Burn them. Howell hesitated. Colonel, these are evidence. Burn them. Dunor repeated. Or I will. The originals were not destroyed. Howell had them copied in secret before sealing them in the courthouse vault. The copies he locked away in his personal safe protection against a future he feared would demand the truth. Search parties spread across Virginia following rumors and sightings. Catherine and Samuel had already crossed into North Carolina, moving through increasingly hostile terrain. They traveled by night, hid by day, and relied on a fragile network Samuel had studied for months: Quaker households, free black settlements, sympathetic farmers who asked nothing. But they were not the only ones on their trail. Slave catchers followed close behind, drawn by Colonel Dunor's reward: $500 for Samuel's return, dead or alive, and $1,000 for information leading to Catherine's recovery. The reward notices upheld the kidnapping story, but the sums told a different truth. No one offered such money for a mere runaway. What Catherine and Samuel could not know was that the letters Howell sealed contained information that made their escape far more complicated than anyone realized. And back at Dunor Hall, the investigation would uncover something even worse. 3 days after the flight, Mrs. Hawthorne returned to Catherine's room, cleaning with frantic determination. Beneath the bedside table, she noticed a loose floorboard. Under it lay a small wooden box. Inside were objects that made her cry out in horror. Among them was a daguerreotype of Samuel clearly commissioned in secret. No photographer in Mecklenburg County would have dared create such an image, and that discovery would turn scandal into catastrophe. Beside the image lay a woman's wedding band, plain gold, sized unmistakably for Catherine's hand. Beneath it rested a folded sheet of paper, written in Catherine's own script, unfinished, and dated 2 weeks before the escape. Mrs. Hawthorne read only the opening lines before letting the page fall as though it scorched her skin. "My dearest Samuel," it began, "by the time you read this, we will have either succeeded in our escape or died in pursuit of it. I write only so that, should we fail, some record remains of the truth the laws of Virginia forbid us to speak. The child I carry is yours." The letter went no further. What Catherine meant to write next, what she intended for the letter to become, was lost forever. Yet its mere existence changed everything. This had never been only a pursuit of freedom or a forbidden attachment. This was a woman fleeing alongside the father of her unborn child, a child who, under Virginia law, would have entered the word enslaved. A child whose birth alone would have been anathema to the society that created them both. With shaking hands, Mrs. Hawthorne carried the box to Taggart. He, in turn, delivered it to Magistrate Howell. Upon reading the unfinished letter, Howell made a choice that would weigh upon him for the remaining 23 years of his life. He placed the contents back inside the box, sealed it, and locked it in the courthouse vault alongside the earlier correspondence. Then he returned to Danor Hall and privately informed Colonel Danor of what had been discovered. What the colonel did next became the subject of hushed speculation for generations. He ordered every searcher off his land without delay. The reward was withdrawn. Messages were sent to all his contacts across Virginia and North Carolina and beyond, declaring the matter finished. His daughter, he announced, had died suddenly of illness and was buried discreetly to avoid public attention. Samuel, he claimed, had been killed 2 counties away while resisting capture. Both stories were fabrications, but they were lies designed to protect something Colonel Danor valued above: truth itself, the standing of his family, and the social order he had devoted his life to preserving. Better to declare his daughter dead than to accept what she had done. Better to invent an ending than to allow the real story to continue unfolding. Yet Catherine and Samuel were still alive, still pushing north through a world that grew more perilous. By the day, not because they were being hunted, but because of what traveled with them. A secret that expanded with every passing week. A life that dismantled every rule their society rested upon. The sudden termination of the official search only deepened suspicion. In taverns and drawing rooms throughout Mecklenburg County, whispers followed Colonel Danor's strange conduct. Some accepted the story of Catherine's death. Others believed she had been confined to an asylum, her mind broken. The most cynical suggested Danor had hired private agents to erase the problem quietly. Magistrate Howell, bound by secrecy yet tormented by conscience, upheld the official account, while privately recording every relevant detail he could not bury. His journals, discovered after his death in 1876, reveal a man fractured by duty and moral revulsion. In an entry dated April 3, 1853, he wrote, "I have today concealed evidence of a crime that is no crime, of love that is forbidden to name, of a child denied by both God's law and man's. May the Lord forgive me for hiding the truth, and forgive me should I ever reveal it." At Danor Hall, life strained toward normalcy but never fully returned. Colonel Danor dismissed Taggart within the week, paying him handsomely to leave Virginia and remain silent. Mrs. Hawthorne stayed but withdrew into herself, spending long hours in the chapel praying for Catherine's soul. The house itself seemed changed. Rooms once under Catherine's care remained closed. Her belongings were packed away. Her name was uttered only in murmurs, if at all. The enslaved community understood more than the household realized. Samuel had occupied a strange place among them, but his literacy had made him quietly powerful. He wrote letters for those who could not, read documents that shaped their lives, and passed on knowledge of the wider world. His disappearance with Catherine stirred complicated reactions, fear that it would bring punishment, or that the impossible had briefly occurred. In the months that followed, rumors traveled through the hidden channels connecting enslaved communities across state lines. Someone claimed the couple had been seen in Pennsylvania. Another swore they'd been sheltered by Quakers near the Maryland line. A woman fitting Catherine's description was said to have given birth in a Philadelphia boarding house. These whispers reached Danor Hall indirectly, a traveling peddlers. Aside, a misdelivered letter quietly shared before being destroyed. Whether Colonel Danor heard them is unknown. If he did, he showed no sign. He had built a wall around the truth and guarded it with relentless resolve. But walls, no matter how solid, cannot withstand truth forever. And 6 months after the flight, that truth would surface in a way no one foresaw. It emerged far from Virginia, in Ripley, Ohio, a small town infamous as a station on the Underground Railroad. In September 1853, a Presbyterian minister named John Rankin, known for his abolitionist activities, received a letter from Philadelphia, signed by a name he did not recognize. It requested assistance in contacting individuals in Virginia regarding an inheritance matter. Suspicious, such language often masked slave-catching schemes. Rankin ignored it. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was more specific. It referenced details only someone deeply familiar with Mecklenburg County could know, and named Colonel James Dunor directly. Cautiously intrigued, Rankin replied, requesting clarification. What he received in return was a 9-page account written in Catherine's own hand. The letter recounted their escape, confirmed their marriage by a sympathetic Pennsylvania minister, and described the birth of their daughter in August 1853. But its purpose was not explanation. Samuel was dead. He had succumbed to typhoid fever in early September, contracted in the crowded Philadelphia boarding house where they had taken refuge. Catherine now stood alone with an infant in a city where she knew no one and had no resources. She begged Rankin to act as an intermediary, to ask whether her father might allow reconciliation, if he might at least acknowledge his grandchild. Rankin was devastated and conflicted. Catherine was not a fugitive. She had violated no law. Samuel had been, but Samuel was gone. The child, enslaved by Virginia statutes at birth, was free under Pennsylvania law. After prolonged reflection and prayer, Rankin wrote to Magistrate Howell carefully, cautiously, explaining that a woman claiming to be Colonel Dunor's daughter sought reconciliation. Howell received the letter in late October 1853. He sat with it for an hour before acting. That afternoon he rode to Dunor Hall. Colonel Dunor received him in the study once occupied by Samuel. Howell explained as gently as possible, then braced himself. Colonel Dunor's reply, recorded in Howell's journal, was brief and final. I have no daughter. If this woman in Philadelphia continues using my family name, inform her I will pursue charges of fraud. She is not to contact me again. Howell tried once. James, she is your daughter. Your grandchild. I have no daughter, Colonel Dunor said again, his voice hardened into iron. And I have no grandchild. This matter is finished. Howell departed in defeat. Soon afterward, he wrote to Rankin explaining that reconciliation was impossible. Along with the letter, he enclosed a modest sum from his own funds, asking that it be delivered to Catherine with his apologies for her father's response. Catherine's reply arrived weeks later. It was restrained, almost formal. She thanked Rankin and Howell for their efforts and explained that she had found work as a seamstress. She was surviving, she wrote, though barely managing to support herself and her infant daughter. She asked for nothing further. The final paragraph of her letter would be quoted in abolitionist newspapers for years to come. I knew when I chose this path that I was choosing death to my former life. I did not foresee how literal that death would be, yet I would choose it again. For the alternative was a slow extinction of the spirit I could no longer endure. My daughter will grow up free, and that is worth all sacrifice. Through Rankin's connections, the letter reached abolitionist publications in Philadelphia and Boston. It was printed without Catherine's name, identifying her only as a young woman of standing from Virginia who relinquished comfort and inheritance for love and liberty. The account circulated widely, cited in sermons and speeches, absorbed into abolitionist literature. In Virginia, those who recognized the details remained silent. Colonel Dunor never acknowledged the articles. Magistrate Howell kept his documentation hidden. Mrs. Hawthorne continued her prayers. The plantation returned to its rhythms of planting and harvest as if nothing had happened. But something fundamental had shifted. What had once seemed immovable, the social order, the rules that govern race, family, and inheritance, now appeared disturbingly fragile. If a planter's own daughter could abandon everything to flee with an enslaved man, what did that reveal about the system itself? And if love could cross boundaries declared absolute, What else might collapse under scrutiny? These were dangerous thoughts, never spoken aloud. Yet they lingered in pauses, in omissions, in the rapid aging of Colonel Denore in the years that followed. In Philadelphia, Catherine Denore, she kept the name, refusing concealment, raised her daughter in a modest two-room apartment above a tailor's shop. She worked long days at her sewing, attended a small Presbyterian congregation, and told her child story. Of her father's stories carefully chosen to highlight Samuel's intelligence, gentleness, and quiet courage. The child, named Sarah, grew up sensing her difference long before she understood it. She knew her father had died before she could remember him. She knew her mother had left Virginia under painful circumstances. She knew her grandfather denied they existed. What she never knew, what Catherine carried silently to her grave, was the full complexity of the choice her parents had made. The planning, the deception, the sealed documents locked away in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, unseen for another generation. Those records remained undisturbed until 1889, when Magistrate Howell's son, sorting through his father's effects, discovered copies of the letters and the unfinished note revealing Catherine's pregnancy. Stunned, he debated for weeks before choosing to make them public. By then, Catherine had been dead 3 years, buried in a Philadelphia cemetery beneath a modest stone naming her only as a beloved mother. Colonel Denore had died in 1871, having never spoken his daughter's name again. Nearly all the principal figures were gone. The plantation system that had defined their world had collapsed in the Civil War. The society that made Catherine and Samuel's choice unthinkable no longer existed. When Howell's son published the letters in a Richmond newspaper, they caused a brief scandal before slipping into obscurity. A few aging abolitionists praised Catherine's courage. A handful of Southern commentators condemned her betrayal. Most readers shook their heads at the tragedy and moved on. What none of them knew, what the letters themselves could not reveal, was that the story remained unfinished. There had been one final letter, never sent, never read, never included in the courthouse vault. Samuel had written it in the weeks before the escape and concealed it when no one thought to look. It remained hidden for 60 years, until renovations to the building that once housed his office exposed a narrow space between walls. Inside lay a tin box carefully sealed. Within it was Samuel's letter addressed not to Catherine, but to the single person whose involvement made the escape possible, a figure whose role no one had ever suspected. That discovery lay decades in the future. In 1853, as winter approached and public interest faded, the people of Mecklenburg County resumed their lives, convinced they understood the affair, unaware that the truth remained buried beneath layers of denial and deliberate silence. The winter of 1853–54 was unusually harsh. Ice storms damaged tobacco fields and left roads impassable for days. At Denore Hall, Colonel Denore withdrew further into isolation, conducting business through intermediaries and rarely leaving his land. His health, once robust despite his age, declined. A persistent cough took hold, resistant to every remedy Mrs. Hawthorne attempted. In Philadelphia, Catherine endured a different struggle. Seamstress work slowed as affluent clients left the city for warmer climates. Sarah, not yet 6 months old, required constant care. The money Howell had sent was quickly exhausted by rent and coal for the tiny stove that barely warmed their rooms. In January, Catherine wrote again to Rankin, not seeking charity, but asking about positions as a governess or teacher. She explained her education and her ability to teach music, literature, and French. Rankin contacted several Quaker families, but all declined. An unmarried woman with Catherine's background, a marriage without legal standing, and a mixed-race child was unwelcome in respectable households. What sustained her was not mercy, but mastery of her craft. A customer impressed by a difficult repair commissioned an entire wardrobe. Then another followed. By spring, Catherine had built a small but steady clientele, women who valued fine needlework and asked few questions. She lived precariously, but she lived. In her letters to Rankin over the following year, she did not complain. She wrote instead about Sarah's first teeth, her early attempts at speech, the unfamiliar freedom of life beyond plantation surveillance. "I am not happy," she wrote in April 1854, "but I am free to be unhappy in my own way, and that is a freedom I never knew in Virginia. Sarah will grow up in a world that, though imperfect, at least allows her to exist. That is enough." Back in Virginia, unresolved questions resurfaced. In the spring of 1854, a man arrived in Boynton claiming to be a journalist from Baltimore researching the Underground Railroad. He asked about Catherine and Samuel, about their escape. Local officials, warned by Howell, refused to engage with him. After a week, he left, having reignited dormant gossip. When Colonel Dunor questioned Mrs. Hawthorne, she admitted the man had shown particular interest in Samuel, his education, his responsibilities, whether he had travelled north before or maintained outside contacts. Disturbed, Colonel Dunor ordered Samuel's remaining belongings brought to the study. There was little: a Bible, spare clothing, a few books. Tucked into the Bible was a folded slip of paper he had never noticed before. It was a letter, dated November 1852, written in unfamiliar hand. Your inquiry is noted. The arrangement may proceed as discussed, pending confirmation of timing and route. Burn this upon receipt. It were unsigned. Dunor read it 3 times, then he took it to Howell. Howell examined it closely. This suggests, he said carefully, that Samuel had contact with the Underground Railroad well before March, that the escape was not impulsive but coordinated. Who helped them? Dunor demanded. Howell had no answer. The handwriting matched no known abolitionist. The paper offered no clues, yet the implication was unmistakable. It provided Dunor with a theory he found deeply comforting. His daughter had not chosen this willingly. She had been manipulated, drawn into a plot orchestrated by abolitionists. Using a literate, enslaved man with access to sensitive information, the letters could have been forged, the relationship invented. It was not perfect, but it was preferable. Howell said nothing, though his journals revealed doubt. Catherine's letters were too specific, too genuine. The unfinished note about her pregnancy defied dismissal, but he let his friend believe what he needed to believe. In June 1854, the so-called journalist reappeared this time in Richmond, asking about northbound travel in early 1853. His inquiries were reported to the governor, prompting investigation. The truth was unsettling. The man was not a journalist, but a Pennsylvania lawyer retained by an anonymous client to investigate Samuel's death. Confronted, he invoked attorney-client privilege. Unable to detain him, Virginia authorities warned him off. He left the state, but continued his work from the north. His reports, preserved years later, revealed a pattern that would take decades to understand. Samuel had not been randomly recruited. He had been identified, contacted, and prepared because of his unique access and position. Someone had known exactly who he was, and someone had helped him escape. The answered question was simple, yet unsettling. Why? Why was this single escape deemed worthy of the time, planning, and risk that underground railroad networks usually reserved for large groups or politically vital operations? The explanation rested in a letter Samuel had written but never mailed, one hidden within the wall of his office and addressed to the person who had made everything possible. But the letter remained undiscovered, and without it, the pattern stayed incomplete. In Philadelphia, Catherine received an unexpected visitor in July of 1854. He was a well-dressed black man who introduced himself as a minister and a friend of Samuel's. He expressed his condolence for Samuel's death and gently asked whether Catherine or the child lacked anything. Naturally cautious of strangers, Catherine was nonetheless moved by his genuine sorrow. She admitted that she was surviving, though life remained difficult. The minister, Reverend Theodore Jenkins, returned a week later with a proposition. A Quaker family he knew in Lancaster County needed a governess for their 3 daughters. They were fully aware of Catherine's circumstances and were prepared to offer her employment, along with a small cottage on their land where she and Sarah could live. The position would include meals, a modest wage, and schooling for Sarah when she came of age. Catherine accepted with gratitude. By August of 1854, she and her daughter had relocated to Lancaster County, settling into a stone cottage on the farm of Isaac and Rebecca Norton Prosperous, principled people whose abolitionist beliefs were matched by practical compassion. For the next 3 years, Catherine lived with a sense of fragile stability. She taught the Norton girls, assisted Rebecca with household work, and raised Sarah in an environment that, while imperfect, was grounded in kindness. Yet, Reverend Jenkins's interest in her went beyond charity. He visited occasionally, bringing small gifts for Sarah and asking careful, deliberate questions about Virginia, about Samuel, about the circumstances of their escape. Slowly, almost unintentionally, Catherine shared more than she meant to. Jenkins seemed particularly focused on Samuel's position at Dinor Hall, his literacy, his access to records and correspondence. He asked if Samuel had ever mentioned documents relating to slave transactions or letters exchanged with certain individuals whose names Catherine did not recognize. At his request, she wrote the names down, promising to say something if memory stirred. Only years later would Catherine understand the true nature of those questions. In 1854 and 1855, she saw Jenkins simply as a rare friend and never questioned his intentions. Back in Virginia, Colonel Dinor's health continued its decline. The persistent cough worsened, eventually diagnosed as consumption. By 1856, he seldom left his bed, managing his affairs through written instructions delivered by Mrs. Hawthorne to the overseer. On a humid August evening, thunder rolling distantly across the fields, he summoned Magistrate Howell to his bedside. Howell never recorded the conversation in full, but that night his journal contained a single entry. James asked me to burn all the papers to let the matter die with him. I said I would consider it. I did not promise. Some truths are too important to destroy, even when they bring only pain. Colonel Dinor died 3 days later. His funeral drew every prominent figure in Mecklenburg County, and the eulogies praised his honor, his business sense, his devotion to Virginia. Catherine's name was never spoken. No unacknowledged heirs were mentioned. His will distributed his estate neatly among nephews and cousins, Dinor Hall passing to one who had long served as his overseer. The enslaved were divided among the heirs. Everything unfolded precisely as the law required, orderly, respectable, complete. Yet tucked inside Colonel Dinor's personal Bible, discovered by Mrs. Hawthorne, as she packed his belongings, lay a single page in his handwriting. She brought it unread to Magistrate Howell, alone in his office. Howell opened it and found a letter addressed to Catherine, dated June 1856, written, but never sent. It began, "My daughter," and continued for 2 pages. He wrote of regret. He acknowledged that she had been right. He confessed his failure to recognize his granddaughter and mourned the cost of his pride. The letter ended with an admission he could no longer undo the past, nor find the strength to change course before dying, but that he thought of Catherine daily, prayed for her, and grieved for what he had lost. He asked forgiveness he could not grant himself. Howell read the letter twice, then locked it away with the others. He never sent it. In his journal he wrote, "What purpose would it serve now? James is dead. Catherine has built a life. Peace is better than reopening wounds, but I cannot destroy this. One day, someone should know that he loved, that he regretted, that he failed." The letter joined an expanding collection of documents, unfinished notes, fragments, cryptic messages, hinting at planning and coordination beyond what Catherine and Samuel could have managed alone. They formed a puzzle whose center remained absent. Still hidden in the wall of Samuel's former office, sealed in its tin box, lay the final piece's letter, explaining who had helped them, and why their escape mattered more than anyone yet understood. In the years after Colonel Dinor's death, surface life settled into calm. Catherine continued teaching. Sarah grew from infancy into childhood. In Virginia, the scandal faded into legend, retold carefully, lessons shifting with the listener. But beneath that calm, tensions tightened, drawing slowly toward revelations no one foresaw. The first thread tightened in 1857 when Reverend Jenkins visited Catherine one final time. He brought news that unsettled the foundations of everything she believed. Samuel, he explained, had not been a chance participant in the Underground Railroad. He had been deliberately recruited. In 1851, rumors had reached abolitionist circles that an illegal slave trading network was operating throughout Virginia, purchasing enslaved people and exporting them to Cuba and Brazil under the cover of legitimate business. Letters and ledgers were said to exist, maintained at major plantations, including Dinor Hall. Samuel had been identified because he was literate, trusted, and positioned close to the correspondence itself. Jenkins had contacted him in late 1851. Samuel agreed to copy any relevant documents he found. He intended to escape regardless, Jenkins said softly. Assisting the cause came first. The realization left Catherine reeling. Were the plans she shared with Samuel real? Or had she unknowingly been part of something larger? Jenkins assured her Samuel's love had been genuine. When Catherine insisted on accompanying him when he learned she was pregnant, he altered everything, risking far more to ensure her safety than any mission required. Samuel had collected dozens of letters. He carried them north 2 days before his death, he entrusted them to Jenkins. Publishing them would ruin what remained of Colonel Denor's reputation. Catherine listened quietly, Sarah playing at her feet, before finally speaking. Her father had destroyed his own reputation long before. If the documents could prevent others from suffering as they had, they should be published. Jenkins revealed one final truth. The lawyer investigating Samuel's death had been hired by one of the men named in the correspondence, seeking to learn how much Samuel had uncovered. The investigation ended after Colonel Denor's death because they believed the evidence had died with him. After Jenkins left, Catherine spent hours alone, holding Sarah, struggling to reconcile love with purpose, intimacy with sacrifice. She never reached a perfect answer, but she wrote again, granting permission to publish. If Samuel's death meant anything, it had to mean truth. 2 more threads followed. In 1858, Isaac Norton suffered a stroke, and Catherine was gently encouraged to seek employment elsewhere. Her story had grown too well known. She was becoming a symbol rather than a teacher. Salvation arrived in the form of a letter from Boston, and a women's seminary offered her a teaching post, housing included. She accepted at once. Boston was louder, sharper, more radical. Catherine lived among people who celebrated her story, but she refused to speak publicly or write it down. She wanted only a quiet life. History, however, was not finished with Catherine Denor. In 1859, Reverend Jenkins finally published Samuel's documents, exposing an illegal slave-trading network tied to respected Virginia planters' men who spoke loudly of honor and Southern rights. The revelations rippled outward, changing everything, and the story once again was no longer buried. The political consequences were immediate and volatile. Colonel Denor's precise role remained unclear within the published documents. He had corresponded with the men implicated in the trade, but whether he understood the illegal nature of their operations was impossible to determine. Some letters hinted that he may have been probing the scheme himself. Others suggested complicity. In his article, Jenkins granted Denor the benefit of uncertainty, portraying him as a possible dupe of more sophisticated criminals. But nuance made little difference. In Virginia, the Denor name became inseparable from scandal. The nephew who inherited Denor Hall sold the property at a loss and relocated to Maryland. Mrs. Hawthorne, now frail and living with a niece, refused to speak of the matter, though she wept silently when shown Jenkins's article. Magistrate Howell, reading it alone in his office, felt a slow dawning horror. The story he thought he understood was far more intricate than he had ever imagined. Samuel had not been merely a man fleeing for love. He had been collecting intelligence that powerful figures had every reason to bury. Catherine had not simply been a defiant daughter. She had been pulled into a conspiracy that extended far beyond Mecklenburg County. Howell retrieved the sealed papers from his safe and read them again, this time searching for confirmation of Jenkins's claims. He found it. Names matched, dates aligned. What once appeared scattered now formed a coherent design. Yet troubling questions remained. How had Jenkins known about Samuel in the first place? How had abolitionist networks learned of his access at Denor Hall? And most disturbingly of all, had Catherine's pregnancy been genuine, or had it provided a convenient justification for her inclusion in the escape? Howell never spoke that last question aloud, but it shadowed his final years. His journals from 1859 reveal a man unsettled by complexity and increasingly unsure whether truth itself could ever be fully known. In Boston, Catherine read Jenkins's article with conflicted emotion. There was pride that Samuel's sacrifice had served a purpose, grief at seeing her father's name dragged once more into disgrace, and an unease she could not resolve about the man she had loved. How much had Samuel shared with her? How much had he concealed? Had their relationship been both genuine affection and calculated risk, intertwined beyond separation? She never found an answer, because the one element that could have resolved everything remained hidden. Samuel's final letter, the one sealed in the wall of his office at Denor Hall, contained the truth. It explained his first contact with Jenkins, his motives, and the shock of discovering that a carefully planned escape had collided with an impossible, undeniable love. It would have shown that he agreed to gather evidence before he ever met Catherine, that he planned to flee alone, that loving her disrupted every calculation. Bringing her north forced him to abandon schedules, invite danger, and defy orders Jenkins had never sanctioned. The letter would have proven that Samuel's love was real, fully real, even as it existed alongside political obligation. But the letter remained hidden, and so Catherine lived with uncertainty, never fully knowing whether she had been loved or used, whether their sacrifice had been shared, or whether she had unknowingly served as cover for resistance work more complex than she imagined. Just when it seems there can be no deeper twist, the story turns darker. If this narrative is sending a chill down your spine, share it with someone who loves historical mysteries. Support the channel by liking this video and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The final thread began to tighten in the autumn of 1859 when a stranger arrived at the Boston Seminary requesting to meet Catherine. He introduced himself as William Crenshaw, a historian studying the Underground Railroad. Polite and composed, he appeared harmless enough that Catherine agreed to speak with him in the seminary parlor with the headmistress present. Crenshaw was precise, well-informed, and disturbingly familiar with her history. He asked about Samuel's work at Dunor Hall, about the documents he had copied, about the exact timing of their escape. Catherine answered cautiously, growing increasingly uneasy. Finally, she asked him directly why he had come. Samuel was not working alone, Crenshaw said. Someone else at Dunor Hall had been feeding him information directing which letters to copy, which records to preserve. Someone embedded within the household, with access Samuel alone could never have had. Someone who continued supplying abolitionist networks even after Samuel fled. The implications were staggering. If Crenshaw was correct, then someone at Dunor Hall, white or enslaved, had acted as an inside informant, using Samuel as a courier. "Why tell me this?" Catherine asked. "Because I believe Samuel left evidence identifying that person," Crenshaw replied. "And I suspect you may know where it is, even if you don't yet realize it." Catherine searched her memory but found nothing. The few items Samuel had brought north were long gone, sold or lost during her early poverty. If he had hidden proof, she had no idea where. Crenshaw departed disappointed, but what he left behind was doubt. If Samuel had not been acting alone, then their escape had not been an isolated act of love, rebellion, but part of an organized resistance operating silently within the system itself. The revelation would have been transformative if it were complete, but it was not. The missing piece, Samuel's letter, remained sealed behind plaster and wood, waiting decades for discovery. In December 1860, South Carolina seceded. The fragile balance holding the nation together collapsed. From Boston, Catherine watched the country slide toward war with a mixture of horror and vindication. Everything Samuel had warned of was unfolding before her eyes. Sarah, now 7, sensed the gravity of events and asked why war was coming. Catherine explained as truthfully as she could about slavery, about irreconcilable division, about a moral reckoning long delayed. "Is that why we left Virginia?" Sarah asked. "Your father knew it was coming," Catherine said softly. "I understood only later." When Fort Sumter fell in April 1861, Catherine followed reports obsessively. She wondered what had become of Dunor Hall, of the people she once knew, of those still enslaved or newly free amid chaos. The seminary became a center for war relief. Catherine worked tirelessly, finding purpose in service and distraction from haunting questions she could no longer suppress. Those questions crystallized in June of 1861, when a letter arrived from Magistrate Howell. "Dunor Hall," he wrote, had been abandoned and now sat under Union control. He had arranged for the documents he had kept, letters, notes, and an unsent confession to be transferred to Catherine. "The war has made old certainties meaningless," Howell wrote. "Perhaps it is time the full truth belongs to you." The documents arrived in August. Catherine read them through the night. Her letters, Samuel's replies, her father's remorse. Too late, she wept not from sorrow alone, but from the crushing weight of complexity. History, she realized, was not a collection of clear choices, but a web of imperfect ones. In October 1861, William Crenshaw returned, pale and urgent. "They found it," he said, "during renovations at Dunor Hall, a space in the wall, a tin box. A letter from Samuel." Catherine read it with trembling hands. He had not been alone. He had left behind someone to continue the work. Evidence hidden in the cellar. A resistance operating beneath Colonel Dunor's own house. Samuel had loved her, and still chosen something greater. And suddenly, at last, the truth emerged. Let me know when you're ready for the next segment. This is approaching the emotional and historical climax. But what if it wasn't what she thought? The documents in the cellar, Catherine asked. What did they actually prove? Crenshaw's face darkened. They showed that the illegal trade was far larger than anyone had guessed. It wasn't limited to a few plantation owners. Bankers were involved, shipping firms, even government officials. Profits from the trade had been funneled directly into pro-slavery political campaigns. The evidence was undeniable. "And it will be used?" Catherine asked. "Yes, in war trials after a Union victory if—" He said quietly. "There will be one," Crenshaw replied. "The North has resources the South cannot match." He paused, then added, "And this means Samuel didn't die for nothing. He collected enough proof to help dismantle a criminal network that enslaved thousands. His unknown partner gathered even more. Together, they created a record that will force accountability." Catherine sat motionless, trying to take it in. Samuel had been a spy, yes, but more than that, he had believed in record, in testimony, in the quiet power of evidence to bring down systems. His love for her had been real. The letters proved that, but it had existed alongside an even larger commitment. "I need to know who helped him," Catherine said at last. "Who stayed behind? Whoever they were, they deserve recognition. They may not want it," Crenshaw said gently. "They survived by staying invisible. The war has freed many people in Virginia, but hatred doesn't disappear overnight. Coming forward could still be dangerous." In the weeks that followed, Catherine became consumed by the mystery of Samuel's unnamed partner. She wrote to Mrs. Hawthorne, who sent back a short reply claiming she knew nothing and wished to be left alone. She wrote to the Union officer occupying Denore Hall, asking if any formerly enslaved people remembered Samuel or knew of his work. The replies were vague. Some recalled that Samuel seemed distant and educated. An elderly woman remembered that he helped people with letters. A former stable worker recalled seeing Samuel meet someone near the tobacco barns but couldn't remember who. The war dragged on through 1862 and 1863. Catherine continued her relief work, raised Sarah, and taught at the seminary. But her thoughts kept returning to the letter Samuel had written to the companion who had been brave enough to stay when he fled. In July of 1863, news of Gettysburg reached Boston. With it came wounded soldiers, refugees, and formerly enslaved people moving north behind the Union Army. While volunteering at a refugee center, Catherine suddenly came face to face with a woman she recognized, Ruth, who had worked in the Denore Hall kitchen. She had been around 40 in 1853. Now she was 50. They stared at one another in silence. "Miss Catherine," Ruth said finally, "they told us you was dead." "I'm not," Catherine replied. "Are you alone?" "My children are free now," Ruth said. "That's all that matters." Catherine helped Ruth find shelter, food, and clothing. 2 days later, she visited her privately. "Ruth," she said carefully, "did you know Samuel was collecting evidence against illegal slave traders?" Ruth's expression froze. "I knew Samuel did paperwork for the master. I once found a letter he'd written to someone working with him, someone who stayed behind after we left." "If you know anything," Catherine began. "I don't," Ruth said sharply, but her eyes betrayed her. Catherine pressed gently. "Whoever helped him made justice possible." "Leave it," Ruth said, her voice hard. "Some things are better left buried. We're free now, that's enough." Catherine saw the fear beneath the words and said no more. That evening Ruth came to Catherine's apartment alone. After Sarah was asleep, Ruth stood in the doorway, trembling. "It wasn't Samuel's idea," she said. "It was mine." Catherine poured tea with shaking hands as Ruth told the story she had carried for decades. Ruth had been born free in Delaware, the daughter of a ship carpenter. At 15, she had been kidnapped and sold south. Colonel Denore purchased her in 1840. She spent 13 years in the kitchen, hiding her literacy, waiting, building quiet connection. When Samuel arrived, Ruth said, "I knew what he was: educated, careful, and placed where he could see things. I watched him for a year before speaking to him. He was planning to run. But I told him running saves one person. Evidence saves hundreds. She couldn't flee. She had children, family, but she could document, she could copy. She could make sure the truth survived." Ruth listened to conversations, memorized names, tracked dates. Samuel accessed the documents and passed copies through Underground Railroad contacts. "When you fell in love," Ruth said softly, "I warned him. But love doesn't listen. By the time you were pregnant, he wanted to protect you. He wasn't supposed to take you, but he couldn't leave you. And our escape," Catherine whispered, "I made sure the watchman delayed his rounds. That Mrs. Hawthorne slept deeply. That the dogs were calm. You didn't escape despite the plantation. You escaped because the plantation allowed it." After Catherine left, Ruth continued alone. She copied everything. When someone grew suspicious, she intervened. When Samuel's father died, she sealed the evidence in the cellar barrel and waited. "I'm telling you now," Ruth said, "because I'm dying. I wanted someone to know he didn't do it alone." Over the following months, Catherine recorded Ruth's testimony in full: names, networks, hiding places. Ruth named dozens who had quietly resisted while appearing obedient. Samuel's love for Catherine had been real, Ruth said, but it had divided him. He tried to save one person and finish the work. He tried to do both. And maybe that was why he didn't survive. Ruth died in February 1864. Her funeral was small, but filled with people she had once protected. They sang hymns she had taught them. Catherine published Ruth's story under her real name. Some newspapers printed it, others buried it, but the evidence spoke. Men were convicted, property seized, reputations destroyed. The documentation network became proof that resistance had existed inside the system itself. In 1865, Catherine returned to Virginia with Sarah. They walked the ruins of Dunor Hall. "Was it worth it?" Sarah asked. "I don't know if it was worth the cost," Catherine said, "but it was necessary." Catherine spent the rest of her life preserving the truth. Ruth's testimony survived. Samuel's letters survived. And years later, when a hidden letter was discovered at Dunor Hall, it confirmed what Catherine had always known. Love and resistance had been intertwined. The bravest had been those who stayed. This story reminds us that history is never simple, that freedom is built not just by escape, but by sacrifice. What would you risk for it? If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more stories like this, and I'll see you in the next video.